So we have to, before we talk about Buck versus Bell, we have to figure out what I'm talking about when I'm talking about eugenic visuality and talking about sort of the visual economy, and talking about that as sort of as a part of the visual economy of eugenics, in which these sort of descriptions and images of Carrie Buck and her mother Vivian Buck and her daughter sort of circulate. And so for this, we are actually going to go to Britain and travel back in time about 50 years. And I'm going to explain to you the kind of the basis for what I'm considering, or how I define this eugenic visuality. And then we'll jump back across the pond to see how that is deployed, this in Buck versus Bell. So we'll start here. I am working on, well, we'll start here, yes. The Anthropometric Committee of the British Association for the Advancement of Science was established in 1875 after John Beddoe, and one of the Anthropometric Committee members, and the eventual author of the 1885 monograph, The Races of Britain, a contribution to the anthropology of Western Europe, gave a paper to the Economic Science and Statistics section, arguing for the utility of collecting vital statistics of the inhabitants of the British Empire at the association's annual meeting. This data, he claimed, would help himself and other ethnographers elucidate the physical characteristics of the various races of the empire that had been determined through studies in philology, history, archaeology, and craniology. The committee was charged with collecting, quote, observations on the systematic examination of heights, weights, etc., of human beings, and the publication of photographs of the typical races of the empire. While this interest in collecting photographs of the typical forms of our race, and that's a quote from Beddoe, emerged from the research of Beddoe and Edward William Brabrook, it was really important actually to the work on composite photographs that Francis Galton began in that same year. Galton, in his 1877 address to the British Association's anthropology department, argued that, quote, his method of superimposing photographs of individuals onto each other to create composite images would allow anthropologists to determine what he called the typical physical characteristics of those in various intellectual and moral categories, intelligent, unintelligent, moral, criminal, etc. Galton would eventually become the chairman of the Anthropometric Committee. So to facilitate the collection of photographs, as the committee did not have the time or the financial resources to, travel around Great Britain and take these photographs themselves, Edward William Brabrook published a call in the Photographic News, which was sort of the most, a very pervasive British newspaper that published on sort of advances in the field of photography, so technical and chemical advances as well, and also talked about, was a huge forum for discussion of how photography ought to be, used in society, so for various sort of social, scientific, and sort of cultural, and then artistic sort of ways. And then it also was a way for, there were also ads for different types of, papers and solutions and other things like that. So it was just this huge, very popular weekly publication that reached a wide variety of people in Great Britain. And so they put out a call in the Photographic News, which informs the readers of the purpose of the Anthropometric Committee, and it describes the kind of photographs that they're seeking from professional and amateur photographers, doctors, medical researchers, and clergy. So the ad says, quote, the plan which the committee have thought it best to adopt is to select a number of districts in which it is believed that a distinct type prevails, and in each such district to request the assistance of as many competent observers as can be found, each to be asked to obtain a limited number of photographs, 6 to 10, representing, in his opinion, the type chiefly prevalent among individuals belonging to families long settled and intermarrying in the district. From the materials thus obtained, the committee hoped to be able to select representative specimens, end quote. Most of the photographs submitted, therefore, are taken by portrait photographers that practice in the areas from which the committee requested photographs. And as such, there are many sort of photographs of individuals, but also families. And there are also photographs of skulls and group portraits, like this portrait of a cricket team. So there are portraits of, photographs of cricket teams, photographs of militias, and photographs of, skulls. And also there are some photographs that are called, that were sold mostly in like souvenir card shops. So you would go, on vacation, in Scotland or something, and you could go pick up souvenir photographs of like typical characters, like from, Scotland or like from Ireland. And some photographers submitted those as well. But I don't have any listed in here. But this gives you a sort of idea. This is the actual sort of photographic albums that they're using, and they selected these photographs, and we'll talk about how they did that here in a moment. I can just leave it there. Right, so the committee, mostly through the labor of James Park Harrison, who I'm currently trying to track down. He's a very difficult person to find out about. They sifted through all of these submitted photographs and selected those that most closely conformed to the racial types that they had defined by composite images of skulls that they had gotten from a book called Crania Britannica that was published in 1845. So because it was seen as the primary physical indicator of race, the data in the photographs would be organized and the racial types hierarchized according to a generalized skull shape. The typical skull shape for each race was determined via the composite imaging technique popularized by Francis Galton. And I show you these because I haven't been able to find any of the, and I don't know if they still exist, the original composites that they used for the photograph. So I don't know which drawings of Crania Britannica they selected from, or the final composites. So I'm showing you these, which are experiments in composite photography that Galton had completed at a different time. So Galton believed that the composite image, and he says this about it, and the qualities that it connotes, the composite facial image, and the qualities it connotes, probably gives a clue to the direction in which the stock of the English race might most easily be improved. It is the essential notion of a race that there should be some ideal, typical form from which the individuals may deviate in all directions, but about which they chiefly cluster, and toward which their descendants will continue to cluster. So you can already see that even his most sort of initial interest in composite photography is focused toward, these eugenic ideas that he later sort of, comes out and publishes essays on in the beginning of the 20th century. But in all of the kind of work with photography that he does, these ideas of eugenics are always sort of on his mind. And he's using these photographs, the way that he's using and experimenting with these photographs actually is what I'm arguing, is one of the things that I argue that actually, allows him to, form the kind of, actually comes to form the epistemological basis of eugenics. So based on the experiments that he conducted with photographs of different types of male prisoners and members of the Royal Society of Engineers, I think this guy with the beard over here is a composite image of geologists, and then the left, or the other one, the unbearded fellow, that is a composite image of Baptist ministers. So both geologists and Baptist ministers sort of have a similar kind of look about them, right? So based on these experiments, Galton believed that the general likeness of a given moral and intellectual type could be discerned by superimposing a large numbers of photographs of individual group members in order to create a cumulative single photograph, which would reveal the greatest areas of physical overlap between the individuals, which would then create a trustworthy image of a generalized racial type. So, right, the process that he has here is that he collected all these photographs of geologists and Baptist ministers and sort of superimposed all of them on one another. And then you come up with this sort of image. So for the anthropometric committee project, as I said a little bit earlier, composite drawings were made from drawings of skulls found in ancient burial locations throughout the United Kingdom that were presented in Joseph Barnard Davis and John Thurnham's 1865 Crania Britannica, delineations and descriptions of the skulls of the Aboriginal and early inhabitants of the British Islands. So after producing these composites, the committee determined that there were sort of three types of skulls presented by Davis and Thurnham, which represented three distinct racial types. Type A, brachycephalic, type B, subdolichocephalic, or type A, dolichocephalic, type B, brachycephalic, and type C, which was subdolichocephalic. And, like, doesn't really matter too much what those mean. Oh, that's why. So you can't see it, but this, so some of these were in, I mixed them up in sort of random order in the previous slides, but now, so this, all of these images that you see on the screen now are sort of representative of one type. And this is how all of the albums are arranged. So it's like there's, you know, the type B album, the type A album, and the type C album. These are the individuals in the type B album, some of them. Here are some in the type A album. And then here are some in the type C album. And it's worth noting that in the sort of hierarchical, the hierarchizing that they did, that type C is the Anglo-Saxon and the, you know, at the top of this like racial hierarchy. So these are the people that represent the top of the racial hierarchy. Type A represents the lower end or the lowest sort of race in this hierarchy. And then type B, which is like, you know, they're just sort of like in the middle. They're not really, they have elements that are both sort of good and bad about them, but generally type B is seen, they're seen as sort of like industrious, whereas type C is sort of as intellectual. So type A or type B probably represents sort of people who are industrious and entrepreneurial, and A is like the intellectual bourgeois class, and then C, generally, they tend to put the working class into type A. But it doesn't always work out as neatly as that. In funny sort of thing, in the type B album, at the very back, there's a portrait of the artist Gustave Manet, which is really weird. So even his intellectual status doesn't save Manet, probably because he is French, from being a inferior racial type. So, oh, we won't go to that yet. Don't be overwhelmed by that yet. So the photographs, right, are bound in 3 separate albums according to the racial type of those photographed. And based on the work that Lorraine Daston and Peter Galison have done on the history of objectivity in the Western sciences, these photographic albums can be read, and I'm reading them as working objects that are forged through a convergence of the epistemological values of mechanical objectivity and truth to nature. And they write of this type of atlas that the characteristic atlases of the mid-19th century mark a transition to atlases that had sought truth to nature in the unabashed description or depiction of the typical, be it the typus, the ideal, the characteristic exemplar, or the average, and the later atlases that sought truth to nature through mechanical objectivity. Like the latter, the characteristic atlases presented figures of actual individuals, not of types or ideals that had not and or could not be observed in a single instance. But like the former, these individuals still embodied types of whose reality the atlas maker was firmly convinced. The typical in this atlas must now be instantiated in the individual, but the typical nonetheless exists to be discerned by judgment and long acquaintance with the phenomena. So it's my argument that each album is designed to allow the viewer to be able to get at the general sense of the appearance of each race by looking through all of the various individuals distributed around the norm created through the skull composites. The process of looking through these albums mimics the mechanized production of the composite image. Individuals photographed would be blended together by the mind, and as the viewer finished the album, a mental composite representing the average physical appearance of the race would be understood. So in addition to skull shape, the anthropometric committee also collected information like height, hair color, weight, arm length, and lots of other sort of characteristics that they thought were important of British people from these same sorts of geographic areas to determine the physical characteristics of their races. The raw numerical data collected by the committee was then processed to visually reveal the normal values or sort of average values for each race through the form of the bell curve. The bell curve, or the normal distribution, is a product of the work of Adolphe Quetelet on the average man. Applying statistical methods to social data like birth, death, criminal behavior, etc., Quetelet desired to develop what is called, by Alan Sapua, a mathematically exact science that would discover the fundamental laws of social phenomena and could predict the likelihood of given phenomena based on an individual data set. Likelihood of death at a certain age became as easily calculable then as that of criminal behavior, given a set of social and environmental facts. So plotting mass amounts of data on a graph, data that was social, physical, environmental, Quetelet observed that the aggregated data tended to densely cluster in certain areas and suggested that these clusters establish norms for sets constituted by those individual instances that make up the cluster. Galton described his method, and so if you sort of look at what I've, you don't focus on the equations. That will just confuse you. But I wanted you to sort of look and explain to you sort of how visually this sort of works, right? So individual cases, right, as you see with that green dot, would be plotted on a graph. And you can think of the axes as being something like, height, weight, right? So individuals of a certain height and weight would be plotted on this graph. And what Quetelet saw when he was graphing these sorts of things was that clusters began, to form, that there seemed to be a lot of people distributed around, a lot of instances of individuals who had, who were clustered around a certain height weight value. And so then he sort of, drew this bell curve to sort of visually represent that. And what you come up with, right, is you see the norm, right, which is exemplified by this number, this vast number of people who have this sort of height weight characteristic, who share this sort of height weight characteristic. And then you define that that is a sort of norm because there are all of these other instances that are also, within a certain, what they call a reasonable distance or a reasonable deviation from that norm. And so the further you get from that norm, the more sort of extreme case you are. And so this sort of enables, it enables Galton, it enables Quetelet, and all these people who use the normal distribution to create a norm or, an average that feels better to them and more sort of true because it eliminates these sort of extant sort of cases, these sort of extreme cases, to the right or to the left of the norm. So Galton, not only is this bell curve used to determine the sort of physical characteristics that the committee attributes to the people photographed. But Galton actually thinks of his method of composite portraiture as operating in the same way as the normal distribution. So he's thinking of the composite portrait as yielding the same kind of truth as the normal distribution. And he says this in a paper that he reads to the Royal Institution in 1879, when this project was sort of in full swing. He says that composite pictures are much more than averages. They are rather the equivalents of those large statistical tables whose totals, divided by the number of cases and entered on the bottom line, are the averages. They are real generalizations because they include the whole of the material under consideration. The blur of their outlines, so, right, you can see the blur of their outlines, which is never great in truly generic composites, except in unimportant details, measures the tendency of individuals to deviate from the central type, right? So you see the way that the composite picture emerges here is in this sort of way that these darker lines, there's no cursor, so it's missing. These darker lines are what, how they determine which, which characteristics are those determinant of the type. Right, so those parts of the skull that are most darkly outlined, the distribution of the variety of individuals adhering generally to this racial norm, right, is indicated by the less darkly outlined regions of the composite photograph. So additionally, for Galton, the use of the photograph to contribute to what he calls a pictorial statistics of the body that could allow increased policing of criminal types. So this is one of the ways that he's also justifying, again, the use of the normal distribution and the use of the composite photograph is all focused on certain types of policing, right? Policing criminal types, policing reproduction, policing, the poor. And this kind of work is also very closely tied to the type of work that Quetelet hoped to engender as well. So, like the German artist Albrecht Dürer, who he mentions in his own work, Quetelet believed that the physical characteristics of the body, when properly measured and recorded, would yield information capable of more firmly establishing racial and social types. And his idea that, quote, social progress would lead to a diminished number of defective and inferior cases, end quote, is also reflected in Galton's support of extended prison sentences for recidivists, which he hoped would restrict, as he says, their opportunities for producing low-class offspring. So in case that wasn't very clear, the sort of goals that both Galton and Quetelet have for their use of the bell curve, and Galton additionally for the composite photograph, are the same. They're both sort of involved in a type of policing, right? And in this way, we can understand that the individual photograph and the plotted point on the graph was, for Galton and the members of the anthropometric committee, was meant to represent an entire race, an observation echoed by Alan Sekula when he writes that in Galton's composite images, quote, the archive attempts to exist as a potent single image, and the single image attempts to achieve the authority of the archive, and the single image attempts to achieve the authority of the archive of the general abstract proposition. And so this is how I'm thinking of defining what I'm calling eugenic visuality. So through these sorts of working objects that the British Association Anthropometric Committee brings together in order to determine the different races of Britain, this type of visuality, this sort of way of seeing and making apparent, this way of seeing individuals, right, is then also created in, I don't even know where I was going. they use the individual photograph, the composite photograph, and the bell curve to create a way of seeing that makes it possible for the individual observer to see an individual and then have a frame of reference in their mind through which to place this person as a criminal, as someone, as a criminal, as someone with, he made images of people with tuberculosis, of people with various sort of STDs, and then this was also used in asylums in Britain to think about, different cases like people who were like schizophrenic and people who, were, had these various sorts of mental illnesses as well. And so what they're doing, I contend, in this album is creating a way of seeing that has as its goal, it has a eugenic goal. And so then we can come back to, now that we're here, now that I've sort of tried to establish that in whatever way made sense, we can come to the details of Buck versus Bell. So Buck versus Bell, right, happened, this was a 1927 case that came out of the state of Virginia. And it was a test case for a policy that its designers in Virginia wanted to be able to implement not sort of casually as they had been doing. So they'd been performing sterilizations of women and men in sort of institutions for, the insane and the feeble-minded and the epileptic, sort of casually for years and years and years. But they wanted to make this a sort of formal practice, right? Because there was a concern about the effect that these sort of feeble-minded and others, other people were having on the makeup of, the population of the United States, the genetic makeup of the population of the United States. And there was a fear, right, that they, had a sort of perverse, sexuality, and, were very, fecund. And so that not sterilizing them would lead to sort of disastrous consequences in the United States, and then would put a unmeasurable strain on the economy for having to support them. And so they wanted to sort of codify the sort of casual policy that they had. And Buck versus Bell was a case that they sort of staged and took to the Supreme Court. So Carrie Buck was scheduled to be sterilized, and then she was appointed a guardian who was the friend of the man who ran the institution where Carrie Buck was institutionalized, and he sued his friend to stop him from sterilizing Carrie Buck, and said that there was no way to prove, that she was feeble-minded. That there was no proof that she was feeble-minded, and no proof that her feeble-mindedness was hereditary. And so this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court case, if you read through, this guy Paul Lombardo does a really good accounting of the sort of details of the case and how it went down. And you see that they try to get as witnesses and people to provide testimony, like eugenicists, famous eugenicists from all over the United States. So, if you're familiar with the research that was done, on the Jukes and the Calicacs by Richard Dugdale, and people that worked with the, Cold Harbor Eugenics Record Office, there was vast amounts of research and people that they tried to draw on in proving that Carrie Buck was feeble-minded, but for various sorts of reasons that wasn't that evidence wasn't very compelling, and it didn't prove, right? It was compelling to see that, okay, if these issues are hereditary, then there is a problem, right? Because the idea of the Jukes is that there was this one lower class woman, the matriarch of the Juke family, who was like morally corrupt and had a lot of children by different men, and then all of these children turned out to be criminals, and they did this big map, basically this big family tree of people descended from this one woman, and followed them throughout their lives and showed that they were all criminals. So they wanted to create this idea of hereditary criminality, through in this hereditary model. And so, but they couldn't prove, right, because Emma had just been born after Emma, Carrie's baby, had just been, Emma is her mother. What is her baby's name? I think her baby's name was Vivi. Maybe it's Victoria. Who knows? But the baby had just been born right before Carrie was scheduled to be sterilized. And so the linchpin, basically, of this case was to figure out whether or not the baby was feeble-minded, right? And so they had already determined through various ways that Emma Buck, Carrie's mother, who's the older woman in this picture, and Carrie were feeble-minded. Emma Buck had, the evidence that she was feeble-minded was that she had been in and out of institutions, for several years, and that, Emma was then later in her life institutionalized. And so it was definitely, she definitely inherited her mother's, feeble-mindedness and mental illness. But there was no way to know for sure whether the baby was also feeble-minded. And that sort of really, really challenged the people involved in this case until they were able to get testimony from a nurse who had contact with Carrie and contact with the baby, and spent a significant amount of time with the baby doing various tests, and they go in great detail about how a lot of the tests that the nurse conducted with Carrie's baby were sort of inconclusive, and that Carrie's baby was sort of so young that there was no real way to really know with the tools that they had whether she was or was not feeble-minded. And so what ended up happening and what she ended up saying on the stand that provided this sort of evidence was that there was just something that didn't look right about Carrie's baby. That something about Carrie's baby did not look right. And that this combined, as is stated in the abstract, with the, comment that, Carrie was also, similarly poor in looks, provided, that, evidence that the court, needed to base their decision about whether or not sterilization of the feeble-minded was something that could be sort of systematically codified in state laws. And so that's what I think is a really interesting connection between what I'm thinking about in the British Association Anthropometric Committee's project and how they determine this eugenic visuality, and what happens in Buck versus Bell, that at the end of all of these processes, that the most compelling evidence is visual, that the most compelling evidence is a certain look that someone has about them, and that this certain look is, what makes them eugenically sort of fit or unfit, right? And then that one can only deploy this look if one is sufficiently trained, or if one can, gather this sort of idea, or can have this sort of, develop this sort of frame of reference that I'm calling a eugenic visuality. And so it's sort of, both of these cases sort of clearly like determine, I was thinking about them in sort of days past with Foucault's sort of assertions in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, right, that he says that sexuality, right, instead of sex acts, right, sex and sexuality became implanted in bodies. And this is, I'm quoting him here. He says, it was implanted in bodies, slipped in beneath modes of conduct, made into a principle of classification and intelligibility. And so in other words, and I'm quoting him again here, the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. And so this work that the British Association and the people involved in the Buck versus Bell trial, they're all participating in this sort of form of like biopolitical power, right? Or they're expressing this sort of biopolitical power where a certain act or a certain look, a certain sort of way of being comes to become implanted in your body, and then comes to form a certain class of individuals who it also characterizes via participation in these acts or in this way of looking. And that's the end.